Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Bruce McPheron, Executive Vice President and Provost of The Ohio State University. Tonight marks the last event in our six-part seminar series, Our Inclusive Path Forward, Addressing Inequities in STEM Education, part of our commitment to making STEM programs more inclusive at Ohio State. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Throughout this series, we've been fortunate to hear from national leaders in the areas of recruiting, retaining, and graduating a diverse population of students in science, technology, engineering, mathematical sciences, and medicine. We're so grateful to have Dr. Sylvia Hurtado with us this evening. We're all looking forward to her keynote address, Inclusive Science, Dimensions for Attracting and Retaining More Diverse Students in Science Training. Before I introduce Dr. Hurtado, I want to welcome a special guest, President Christina M. Johnson, who's also joining us this evening. Thank you, President Johnson, for making diversity, equity, and inclusion an important part of your vision for Ohio State and for being here tonight. I'd also like to thank Dr. Don Pope Davis, Dean of the College of Education and Human Ecology, who will be moderating a Q&A session at the end of Dr. Hurtado's presentation. A quick housekeeping item, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions for Dr. Hurtado following her lecture. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank our series sponsors, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the College of Education and Human Ecology, the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences, the Michael V. Drake Institute for Teaching and Learning, the Office of Student Academic Success, and Ohio State's regional campuses. Now, without further ado, I have the honor of introducing Dr. Hurtado. Dr. Hurtado is a professor in the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She's also taught at the University of Michigan. Dr. Hurtado earned her bachelor's degree in sociology from Princeton University, her master's degree in administration, planning, and social policy from Harvard, and a PhD in education from UCLA. She studies campus climate, organizational change, and STEM workforce diversification with a focus on intergroup relations, communicating across differences, and the fundamentals of U.S. higher education. She's been a keynote speaker on education at conferences around the world. We're thrilled to welcome her to Ohio State this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hurtado.
Okay, I think I'm there.
You are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, this is a great honor and a pleasure to speak to everyone. And being the last in a series, I'm sure you have probably many of the issues that I will address today. But what I want to talk about is a little bit of our research that's been going on, and also address this notion of inequities in STEM that continue and persist, and what we might be able to do as institutions and as individuals interested in continuing on. So my overview today is basically just touching on some recent academic work that recognizes systemic racism and exclusion in STEM. What is that about? What's going on? A second, I think the most important, is really introducing a framework, what I call inclusive science. And a lot of it is based on diversity research, but also research on the National Institutes of Health sponsorship of campuses within the Diversity Program Consortium. And they're focused on diversifying the research workforce using a very comprehensive approach, addressing undergraduate training, faculty development, and institutional capacity building. So I'm happy to talk more about that broader initiative, but also introduce some things that we're beginning to write about based on some case studies that we've done with the institutions. So the focus on systemic exclusion in STEM, I think, is really important. So why is there still relatively little change? And we need to really start thinking about, perhaps it has less to do with our students and more to do with what we were doing or were not doing in higher education. And I think several actual national reports from the National Academies have actually identified this as an important time to expand representation and participation for a variety of reasons, obviously. And we're at a crossroads in addressing diversity in STEM. So I think it's important to really think about it. What we're beginning to find is that policies, practices, and procedures allow forms of exclusion to remain intact. There's a more recent piece by Ebony McGee on structural racism in STEM higher education that was recently published, an educational researcher that actually addresses that. And we're also hearing stories of individuals navigating academic environments that are hostile to their identities. This has been in Nature and the New York Times. So the National Academies of Reports now, many of them that you may be addressing, most recent one that I've been involved in is the science of effective mentoring in STEM. And basically, almost each of those reports are now addressing recommendations for institutional and cultural change to provide to improve diversity in education. So let me start with really some notions of terms we might be familiar with, and then another that we may not be as familiar with. And many of you heard about inclusive excellence. Well, I want to talk a little bit about inclusive science because it builds on inclusive excellence. Now, originally, inclusive excellence had some basic tenets about um, providing educational excellence for greater equity in learning outcomes. That's how the American Association of College and Universities have spoken about it, and others like President Freeman Rabowski have also talked about it. Inclusive science is really meant to create greater access to the full diversity of talent for the STEM fields. And by STEM, we include medicine and that workforce. So one of the things that early pieces on inclusive science have talked about is students with disabilities and accessibility within the classrooms. But I want to today expand that notion beyond the classrooms and also to extend it to other groups. They're also, by the way, have used the term related to women in science as well. So the concepts of inclusive excellence and inclusive science have been used in STEM education, but they differ in the extent to which structures or practices are reformed or maintained in implementation. Sometimes we implement inclusive excellence, kind of maintaining our traditional notions of what excellence is, and we add diversity. And this is sometimes done in what I call kind of boutique programs, those that are going to be scholars programs, very important to increase representation, but we also realize that the numbers stay very small when we are focusing on those programs with those programs rather than changing the entire institution. So let me start with a little bit about our methods. And we've been studying, and in fact, I have several NIH projects, but the one I want to talk about today is really looking at 10 sites, 11 campuses that have been collaborating as part of the NIH Build program. And we conducted case studies and interviews across those sites with faculty, senior administrators, STEM program directors. We also did focus groups with students in the programs. We're about to launch another set of final case studies about what happened since their funding started almost 8 years ago. So we coded themes, and most of those themes were based on what NIH and the Diversity Program Consortium together developed what they call Hallmarks of Success. And these are at the student, faculty, and institutional level. So if you're interested, look up Hallmarks Student Success NIH. You'll see some definitions and actually goals to achieve. And now people are developing metrics to kind of address some of those issues. So the case studies I just want to talk about come from our reports, the transcripts. We had an interrelated reliability fairly high. We looked at issues across campuses. I'm only going to be able to give a few examples, certainly because this is pretty much a longer piece that we're actually currently writing, but I do want to give some of those examples. So let me start with dimensions of the inclusive science framework. And there is a piece that we did for BMC proceedings, myself, Damani White-Lewis, and Keith Norris have a piece that actually addresses the beginning point of that. And it really talks about the entire consortium and framework and what has been going on. But we've now modified the framework based on having visited the campuses and understanding what they're implementing. So this is the framework as I've now begun to conceptualize based on what we've done. And so one of the things, well, let me just say several things institutions do when they want to address underrepresentation and also improve science training. Of course, they focus on students, right? Improve student research training, improve the support they give students in specific programs. But there's also several that are really thinking about diversity in the research and curricular innovation that is changing the teaching and learning in STEM. Another component is faculty development, is really understanding what kind of new things we need to do to train faculty, whether that's in teaching and learning components or as actually in trying to understand our students. I'm going to give some newer examples of some of that from our work. And then also, I think many institutions are building what I call powerful partnerships for pipeline programs. And I want to talk about a few of those that really establish connections with diverse institutions. So the red box is really what everybody's striving for. The goal is increasing participation. But I want to talk about each of these components and also provide some examples and then allow some time for question and answer. So let me start with participation of diverse researchers. Why increase participation? Well, we know from the research that the benefits of diversity in college for learning and democratic outcomes have been well documented. We're also seeing studies on innovations in work groups and research products. And we also know there could be a lag in global competition without really initiating a talent development approach. So the goal of intervention programs, at least many of those funded by NIH, is to diversify the biomedical workforce, accomplished by providing opportunities to students who also support faculty development and institutional capacity building. In other words, this is one of their signature kinds of programs, but they're also, if you are not aware, there's a request for information now about how NIH can better address systemic racism, and they're looking for input that will guide funding in the future. Another component is monitoring equity and composition and representation, and that's part of the participation of diverse researchers we actually look at. So what are campuses doing? A number of campuses are increasing participation, but looking along the entire career pathway. That is, they're consolidating programs or creating bridges across their programs to not just address early entry into STEM, which is very important, but also transition to the major and then transition from the major to postgraduate kinds of opportunities. So there are several. Xavier University is a really good example of one of the campuses that's doing that. The other component of increasing participation is campuses are now being more systematic about thinking about targeting specific groups. Some institutions within the consortium are targeting students with disabilities. Others are targeting communities that have been seriously underserved, like Pacific Islander communities or rural communities or indigenous communities in terms of fostering more not only recruiting students, but also fostering communication and connections with that. And other campuses focusing on foster students. And all of these are at racially diverse institutions that also have a high number of Pell Grant recipients. This was part of the selection criteria. Now, I want to say that the build programs are primarily teaching institutions. Some of them are moving up the research rankings in terms of moving from intensive research 3 to 2 or from 2 to 1 in terms of what they're doing. But currently they were not receiving as many research funds as anticipated as other campuses are. And that was the initial part of NIH thinking and trying to kind of redistribute resources and what they were attempting to do. So What did they do with all that money? And for some campuses, it was over $20 million that they are each able to receive over a 10-year period. So really thinking about some of the things they've done. In terms of diversity, innovations, and research in the science curriculum, what were they doing? In order to attract diverse researchers and maintain interest, there are several studies that have been done to understand for example, utility value interventions in biology, which close achievement gaps for first generation and underrepresented students. That is, they began to understand that the more that students, particular students, are more driven to the science when they can see real value in terms of connections with what they like to do, and particularly those that have more altruistic values tend to stay in STEM. And so some of the campuses were thinking we need to rethink what we're doing in the curriculum. Some of them, for example, combined their resources to address health disparities in research because of the altruistic nature of some of the developing scientists and interest in keeping them in STEM. Of course, another component which was very important, and they're doing a lot of innovations in teaching and learning, is really this thinking about pedagogies of inclusion and active learning, which the research is beginning to show reduces disparities in achievement. So certainly we've had this big, huge pandemic, and it may have affected what we would like to do in terms of active learning. But I think we're also beginning to find new ways of introducing that, particularly in an online environment. I want to use one example of an institution that I think really thought hard about what they should do, and it's the University of Alaska. They developed what they called a One Health paradigm that links human, environment, and animal health. And it really reflects the indigenous philosophy, but also the philosophies of a lot of the rural communities which this campus serves. And of course, I would say the majority of Alaska is rural. And so, in order to bring students and identify researchers and develop them, and particularly attract others to that, they have to really think about being more, I would say, connected with their communities, but from a philosophical standpoint that also can guide curricular development, interdisciplinary connections. And then also, I want to say that it was so successful that they adopted as a major research initiative that involves students. So now they're attracting grants best based on the One Health paradigm. They're not the only campus that has adopted that paradigm, but I want to say that we saw some very successful ways in which they really rethought how they were addressing, where they were putting their resources, and also how they were kind of creating connections, interdisciplinary connections. So another component the campuses decided to focus on was the climate for diversity. My work has, of course, focused on campus racial climates for many, many years, and we know it affects transition to college and student outcomes. And so, with that knowledge, they began to implement a number of things. They also realized that experiences with racism in education and work environments are linked with stress and negative health outcomes. Those are part of the research. And by the way, all these numbers, they relate to references that I'm going to provide, and you'll have a copy of the slide in the end. So let me provide an example for what two of the campuses were doing. They were doing a lot of faculty development and mentor training to be able to recognize this notion of racial microaggressions or stereotyping that hinders academic development, or even helping faculty become more aware of the effects of being one of the few in science. That is, there's a lot of, there could be stereotyping, this person could be under a microscope, the kinds of things that are going on that I think they have to be more aware of. So there is a recognition that campus racial climates have an effect, and they can be, it could be from the entire institution, it could be at the department level, it could be in labs. And so these are the things that campuses are now beginning to address in order to really make environments and the work environments more conducive to success. Another approach the campuses were taking, and this is this notion of connections with diverse communities. And by the way, each of these areas, as you remember from the original model, I think are part of what we're defining as inclusive science, that we're actually doing these things in important ways that really start to address some of the inequities. The connections with diverse communities were important in that campuses established direct contact with communities that have been previously invisible in data or programs or marginalized due to location or lack of opportunity. Again, I want to say this connection, for example, with Indigenous communities. Um, Faculty had to really rethink what they were doing because certainly from the standpoint of those communities, they could be thought of as taking their leadership and doing what with them, assimilating them instead of really developing connections. So one of the things that some of the campuses were doing, or several of the things, were sharing resources with partnerships that we're developing with schools and post-baccalaureate institutions to extend preparation from transitions to college and then subsequently to graduate programs. That is, they began to see their institution as part of an ecology, part of a larger pipeline, and then developing those connections with those institutions. There are some institutions now, for example, that are developing connections with minority serving institutions, historically Black or Hispanic serving institutions, and developing some connections there for that to become part of that pipeline. So, what were they doing? They were creating an intercampus learning community for students and faculty in urban areas, and then also extending their reach to communities that may have been previously underserved, creating research partnerships and student internships, but also then allowing students to really identify problems within their communities that they wanted to solve using science and then building on that initiative. And then also, some of them were actually helping communities to collect their own data, for example, on their water, on their soil, on things that were important to them because how they've been impacted by toxic water and soil issues in their communities, and then having students and the university be engaged in that. So another component, and this sort of one of my graduate students actually identified this because it just jumped out at the data that we were looking at, is really providing some tangible forms of institutional support. And these are usually thought of as material resources that are an asset for student success. For example, many times we may think, well, these students should be engaged in undergraduate research because it's a very high impact practice. Yes, the data say that very importantly, but in order to participate, you have to have the financial means to do so. In other words, instead of working somewhere that would be outside of science or outside of campus, that you would actually have some financial support or even be able to provide earn and learn opportunities within the institution. So I think that's very important in STEM to be able to do that. The other thing that they're doing is rethinking their advising programs to be more intrusive, to track student performance in order to make sure that students make the transitions from classrooms to major and then to graduation. And then also providing a space and place for learning groups to gather. And I think several campuses actually ended up renovating classrooms, renovating spaces so that they could actually have advising, tutoring, and study groups come together there. Of course, now we're in the online environment, so hopefully some of those have been extended online, and I'm sure that some of that staff has actually had to transition to do some of those things. The other component is they were using the financial support to attract high achieving students of both low income and middle income students to STEM. That is, for low income students, it could if they've been gapped in their financial packages, or for middle income students whose parents are really don't have a lot of assets. They're new. They were the first generation, and now they're providing more opportunities for their sons and daughters. They're really nervous about the costs. So some of this information, some of this financial support was really key. And I want to say that now the important thing that NIH is saying, for every year as the funding begins to diminish, those campuses have to replace it with either institutional funds, but many of them are actually college presidents are seeking funding from individuals and philanthropic organizations that are going to support STEM achievement, and are finding that as a really great opportunity to begin to transition off grant funded kinds of programs. So the last area, and certainly there are many other areas, but I want to speak about one in particular, is a lot of research has happened, and I'm sure some of your speakers have talked about students developing a science identity that they need to see themselves and be recognized, right, as science people, science workers, science students, and developing that is very important. But we also have to think about them integrating their racial, ethnic, and gender identities and class identities in this process. So these identity intersections are real important to students rather than identity interference. And the research has really shown how some students have experienced this identity interference. That is, you don't expect them to put a lab coat over their race, gender, or class identities and then remove it, right? Though some of them are asked to do that. And so we have to really think about the whole student and how they can see themselves navigating using role models of same race, same gender, same class differences. Many faculty are identifying themselves as also being first generation to go to college and also achieve, to really think about how to navigate advanced science training in that way. Now, let me just say something about mentorship, because some same race and same gender mentorship is not always possible. In our report, the national report that we just uh, published from the National Academies Press on the science of effective mentorship in STEM, is that we are seeing that the research is not decided on this, and that's because the representation is still very low. And one solution then is identify multiple mentors, some of which will provide psychosocial support, others will be role models, others will provide network connections, or what we call instrumental support, that is specific kinds of career guidance. So really thinking about providing mentors that can provide these different functions within a mentoring relationship is really key. So let me give you a practice example from at least 3 of the campuses engaged in culturally aware mentor training for undergraduate and graduate faculty. That is University of Wisconsin, and certainly through the National Research Mentoring Network, which is also sponsored by NIH, was launched at kind of an active kind of master trainer type of initiative that actually promoted mentor training broadly, but also developed this cultural aware mentor training. And I'm in the middle of actually working with that group in graduate training, training of graduate faculty that work with graduate students. And so part of that training is really understanding how one's identity is very key, and how we each perform our identity. As instructors, we're performing our identity. When students see me, they see a Latina professor. I can't change that. And they see other aspects of the way I interact, the way I present, the way everything about me, they can see parts of that identity, right? So we are performing our identity in these various contexts. And students, we need to be aware also of how important students' identities are to them and to their communities. Another thing that most of the campuses are doing is they're taking their students to conferences that actually have role models, that actually have a higher number of underrepresented groups. For example, SACNAS and Abercrams, but there are others like SHIP and other kinds of conferences where students can present their research and see others that are like them, and actually, find community in that, in terms of their identity, so that In fact, this morning we just saw our communications group for the DPC. We just saw a video, produce videos and saying this is what a scientist looks like, and providing people who are already graduates, but also undergraduates who are basically talking about how important some of these things were to them. And so hopefully we'll be able to share some of those. I just saw the video this morning. I'm not sure if it's up online yet, but if I'm able to find it, I'll share it with you as well. But I thought it was very powerful for them to say, this is what science looks like. In this case, they were African-American females that we're talking about, their experiences and the science they do. So there are things we can do to break down the boundaries that we've created. So in concluding, I want to say that the scholarship of diversity is vast. I have a lot of references, by the way, so you will be able to use them. And much more is now available in STEM fields as a result of NIH and NSF investment in not only programs, but also the evaluation component. And also, I think I have to give a lot of credit to Cliff Poudry at NIH, who basically started an R01 process for researchers that would collaborate, social science researchers that would collaborate with scientists to understand diverse groups, learning, achievement, pipeline issues, all of the things that are important for advancing the work in education on STEM. And more recently, a lot of the research, and I didn't really give the example in the beginning, but for example, the Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious journals, really recognizes that their own settler colonialist legacy and stated that racism is a major public health emergency of global concern that operates through self-perpetuating, reinforcing systems in healthcare, housing, education, employment, and that anti-racism is a struggle that everyone must join. So we are finding a moment where we're able to talk about these things instead of really attributing things to students. We're really talking about fixing institutions now. And I think that's probably where we need to look. As I tell my colleagues at UCLA, we have the most talented students we have had in the history of this institution. We should be doing even better. And by them, and also all of them should be succeeding. And if they're not, then that has a lot to do with what the institution is not doing. So we need to rethink practices, structures, processes, and policies for greater equity, guided by better understanding. And as I said, there's a lot more research and not assumptions about diverse students. And that structural change in institutions is needed to address some of these systemic forms of exclusion. And I hope that my model has been able to begin to show how institutions are able to do that. So at this point, let me just show me the last slide. These are all the references that I've used for this talk, and I'll make those available. So let me stop share. So thank you. So I'll turn it to Dean Pope Davis to help us.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Hurtado. Appreciate the summary and the overview that you provided. I'm going to now move to some questions based upon what you have just shared with us. And let me start with a concept you presented early in your presentation. You used the concept of intrusive advising. The term, and in fact, we have a question related to that. The word intrusive has a kind of a negative connotation. I'm just thinking of the implication that may have, that I'm intruding on you, I'm intruding into the space and or what have you. And sometimes when you intrude, it's not always accepted with kindness. But in the overall concept, say a little more about what you mean by that, particularly from a psychosocial perspectives with diverse communities who have a history of wanting to protect their cultural reference group as a way of if you will, as a defense mechanism against people intruding on what they believe is important. Say a little more about that.
Well, thank you, because I should really think about my language carefully, but this is how some educators have really talked about it. And I think the main reason it's called intrusive advising is because a lot of advising is reactive. They wait for students to come to them, and there's not a proactive. So maybe it should be proactive advising. Though I have to say, even students in our focus groups talked about it being intrusive. They basically said, why do we have to meet with this advisor? You know, nothing's going wrong. And we said, we don't know whether that's the truth or not. We a science division, where the advisors were really asked to touch base with each of the students that were in these build programs. And so they found it very intrusive, I have to say. But I think the point is this, for some students, and I have to say this happens with a lot of first generation students, they don't realize what advisors can do for them. And maybe we need to ask what the advisor could do for them. But I think one of the campuses began to give advisors new roles so that they were actually more proactive in checking on students, understanding what was going on, connecting them with people that can be more helpful depending what the problem is. And so that the advisors were doing kind of a broader work than what they were initially doing. In other words, it did require restructuring the role somewhat so that they were much more proactive in checking in on students. And also that and at least for students in these programs, the expectation was that they would have to, and that's why I said they did call it intrusive, but it was also a way to make sure to get students, and we have now the capacities with some data to actually check on students early on at midterm, if midterm exams and whatnot are I would say are reported in some kind of way, so that we have an early warning system, right, in place to be able to do this. And for advisors to not just wait for students to make appointments, and because some of them have very large caseloads, you know, they can just, people are in and out. But how do you transform the role so that it is much more proactive? It is more thinking longer term than what the immediate problem is. And then also making sure, and we did have some complaints from some students, that some advisors were not aware of all the science courses or what they operated like. And so they wanted the advisors to even be better trained to help them. And so I think if we think about that, that will be really important in terms of how the role has or has not evolved, and what can we do to make sure that students are successful and they stay along the pathway. If certainly they have determined this is something they truly want to do and they have the strong motivation to do it.
So to follow up, then the role of the advisor is changing, or has to change, particularly given the contemporary demand in this field. Have you seen strategies that allow these advisors to recognize that the traditional model no longer works because it perpetuates the status quo to some extent, and there's a need to shift, and as you talked later on, to a model that requires cultural responsiveness, if you will. Could you speak to that concept a bit?
Mm-hmm. So this is a lot, but I'll have to say that for a lot of the culturally aware mentoring, for example, has really focused on faculty, some on staff, but not as much. So there's lots that I think advisors can also be trained to do in terms of thinking about their professional development. In other words, not just requiring people do more, and like I say, in terms of some of the institutional transformation models that I presented in other contexts is really thinking about, it's almost easier to get people into the mindset of doing more, doing better, but not really implementing the behaviors. And we have to really think about, well, what's preventing the behavior change? Perhaps it's old expectations or that are in place, or processes or policies that are in place that need to be rethought. But how are we actually, I want to say, empowering people to take more of a role that's really going to have an impact, right? And one of the ways is to provide some kind of professional development, whether that's retraining about how these classrooms are changing, how teaching and learning is changing, how we need to be more active with our students in terms of the needs that might arise, and creating, I don't know, for some it could be much more better understanding or reorganizing so that you have a much more one-stop shop online, and also a place where that can happen. You actually get a lot more of that. Another thing that I've seen institutions do, and this has been, for example, the work that I've done with minority serving institutions in particular, is that we had some staff that have been really successful on a campus kind of cross-train with another campus that wants to adopt some of those new those kinds of initiatives, particularly when it comes to student completion. And so we called Mentor Campus, but really campuses learn from each other. And it was it cost money, obviously, but I think online can be done. I mean, because we had people visit each other's campuses, right, and come together. So there was this cross-institutional learning that was going on about, gee, we can do that. That's a really great idea. We can do that. Or how much did it cost? How do we build the infrastructure, right? So thinking about that, I think, are really important questions. And we don't really think about it as kind of this cross-institutional learning that can happen that is also an excellent way of doing professional development. So I think let's broaden the notion of what that professional development or even faculty development looks like, particularly if we also include culturally or mentoring, but also learning to adopt practices that seem to be quite effective, even in experimental mode.
So one of the things you're well acquainted with in looking at some of your work is the notion of how do you hit on it a little bit about how do you get faculty to change? How do you get people to pivot in a direction that says this is for the students, and therefore if we do these things differently, we can have a greater impact and have models in the STEM area, as the case may be. What are some of the strategies that you've seen that have been helpful in incentivizing faculty, departments, et cetera, to change in this direction, and helping them to understand that there's a long game here, that if we make these steps now, we have the ability to impact the lives of so many other people and bring more people into the field. Can you speak to what you've observed from your research?
Sure. There's a lot I think people are doing, but let me start with where you sit because you're provost. Is that a lot of people are not aware of, and I find this over and over, particularly when people go into administration, they tend to forget, is that faculty is a consensus culture. That is, we do a lot of things by consensus. We hire, we decide not to promote, we adopt curriculum on a consensus basis. We don't like when anyone disagrees because we want to make sure this is almost, right? Almost an entire, a clear consensus. That makes the institution very stable, but also resistant to change. Because if one person disagrees, and they can disagree because they don't want to do it, whatever the reason might be, we don't know. There are variety, obviously. Is that we have to understand that culture, but several things have really changed that really get people to change. One is having some data or research that begins to show not just the problem, but also why it shouldn't be. And I think, for example, I've seen this in the notion of, for example, grading on a curve, looking at that across groups, showing that and showing that it's different in different terms, and students could be more successful in a later term as opposed to an earlier term. Faculty say, well, why would that be? That shouldn't happen, right? So they begin to question. So I think the data is very helpful for beginning the conversation, asking the questions, changing mindset, and then asking about what can be. But I think you have to think about, I think it's almost easier to open people's mind, but it's changing the behavior that's really key. That's also requires buy-in. Some institutions, I've seen this in teaching and learning centers, is the way they try to get more people involved in a reform. And I've looked at calculus reform, I've looked at several other reforms that trend towards active learning and whatnot, is they've gotten senior people involved that people have a lot of respect for. And when that person comes along, they say, oh, well, so-and-so is doing it. In other words, there's some key, in the Midwest, I was in the Midwest for a long time, they call them tail twisters. So you rely on a few, of course, another way to say it is opinion leaders. Maybe that's an easier way to say it, but tail twisters is kind of a good Midwestern analogy. Yeah. And there are people who are converted to the notion of we've got to change and are trying and implementing some of these reforms themselves that become an example. And so really finding some of the tail twisters, I think, is a strategy some have used. Another, I'm very strong on faculty development, but thinking carefully about how that's going to be well received. And most time I've heard it doesn't help if Sylvia comes, but it helps if someone like Carl Wyman comes, right, to talk about these things, right, and particularly in the same field. So there's a number of things people can do, but I think ultimately you are striving towards creating greater buy-in, and you need, as Carl Wyman has said, full department commitment happens, the change will happen, right, when you have that. And then I want to say something that we don't talk a lot about is accountability mechanisms. And so putting some accountability mechanisms in place is really key, and that can be implemented by leaders across campus to put some accountability mechanisms. Like we were stunned to find in some of our analyses of our own campus that some deans or department chairs did not even keep track of the lecturers and who was teaching and if they were trained in grading and all of those things. We were stunned. We said, oh my gosh, the number of students that are subjected to or actually have lecturers in these fields is really high, particularly mathematics. And we're not really tracking what we're doing with that group of instructors and certainly laborers that we have at our institution that are working directly with students. So there are many levels to this.
Sure. Let me ask you two questions that are connected. One is to speak a little more about the concept of identity interference and expand upon that concept. And this may also relate to the fact that when you talk about advisors and faculty taking on these roles and representation with a diverse group, speak to the need then to have advisors and faculty look more like the students that you are trying to attract to this area. Can you speak to those two concepts?
Sure. I think, and I'm hoping this is a turning point because we're actually seeing some change, is that, most people in science will say, oh, well, race diversity has nothing to do with science. And it's true, it's not typically part of the content, but the examples I gave today were campuses that increased interest by addressing health disparities, by working with particular kinds of science problems that were specific to diverse communities, that actually required people who had an understanding of those communities, that is faculty, In one case, they paired with American Indian Studies, right, to help understand those communities further and connect with them. Um, so there's a lot of kind of different ways of thinking about this that gets really deep in terms of rethinking what we do. And in that process, they maintained connections with students' communities, diverse communities that were important to them, as I talked about the altruistic um, scientist that wants to really help, particularly in areas that have affected their family or their community directly. So that doesn't erase identity, and I think that's really what we have to do is say. And I love when a scientist stands up and says, "What does diversity have to do?"
Yes.
Well, you are performing your identity in classrooms every day. You are performing your identity, and you're saying race doesn't matter because race doesn't matter to you because you're predominantly white. It's a predominantly white environment. You are a white faculty member, white male faculty member, etc. Right? So I think we're breaking that down. We're breaking that apart because we're saying, yes, there are ways to be more culturally responsive and integrate identity, because those identities are not, you don't put them in a box. Those students, that's part of the identity interference. They felt that if they did identify, if they did something that revealed they were thinking, or even had different opinions about some of the things that actually are related to their race, gender, and class, that they would be ostracized, and perhaps they were. So the identity interference was this notion of trying to be identity less, but why should we ask any person to be less than who they are, right? And so I think we're rethinking all of that. So connections with diversification of the faculty and staff, the role models we need. There's no question we need that. There's no question that's very, very important because, as some students have said, directly, if we can't see someone that's like us, how do we know that we're going to be, they're going to be the first? So every group thinks they're the first. Or as one student said, I thought I was the only one going through, I thought I was the only first generation college student. I was like, no, the 70% of them are Latino in our institution.
Yeah.
So you weren't the only one, but you were made to believe you were. And that is just really stunning. So yes, I think we really have to diversify. In the meantime, we also have to make sure that others are more responsive and don't erase race or gender or class, because those are important parts of people's identity.
Yeah. Can you say a little more about the data that's used? Historically, some of this data I can remember back in the day about the presence of diversity in STEM, for example, were normed on a majority population, and so people would make recommendations and generalizability to larger populations. And so there's this question here about the invisibility of people in the data. How do we get more researchers to truly move into communities that have historically been invisible in this field, so that we can appropriately develop the interventions and strategies that can make more students, more first generation low income communities be interested in science?
Well, I think the one thing is, and certainly we're all in a budget situation right now, but when the FTEs do open up, that we do identify people that have that expertise, right? Finding people that have that expertise to make those connections, to build them, that can bring research funds to those kinds of initiatives that will train many more students. And right now, like I said, NIH is open. They're starting a faculty initiative now that's going to be diversification of the faculty, and also understanding long term how institutions achieve it, which is a big change for them. But they felt it's very key, and they're going to be directing resources towards that. So, so I think one is really finding, and you know, I think I had one provost once ask me at the long end of a long day talking about climate and all these areas. He said, "What's the one thing we can do?" And I was like, "Oh my gosh!" After everything I talked about, and I said, "Okay, let me think about it." I said, "The one thing you can do is diversify your faculty because you change the nature of research. Um, Long term, they outlast most leaders. They're there for many, many, many years. Um, they are, role models for underrepresented groups. Um, we understand also that there's some teaching differences. At least the early research began to see some teaching differences in terms of um, um, attention to student-related issues that were differences between race and gender that we were actually acknowledging. Um, at the same time, we have to make sure we don't overburden these individuals who already have a lot of, certainly committee assignments, but also, students that are clamoring to be part of them. And, I think right now we're trying to say, well, if we're going to open up some FTE, we need to really think about diversity as a key area we want to focus on for the next few years.
You're getting into that area of cultural taxation
Yes.
that's part of, and that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that. Lastly, we're running out of time, and one of the things that you spoke to is some of these institutional changes that need to occur, and you are aware from your research, from what I've seen, that there is sometimes a contradistinction between moving these initiatives forward, diversifying, being inclusive, yet the institutional model continues to be complacent. The policies and procedures that institutions have that prevent the full inclusion. Are there some best practices you can leave us with as we close up this session that says, here are some things, if you haven't thought about, you should try doing based upon your research and experience?
Well, I hope that my model and then the examples I used today were actually some good ones.
Okay.
They are not, and that's why I use the model of the different areas people can work in, because in each of those areas we had, attention to the climate. We had building stronger partnerships for long term, from college entry until into graduate education, and certainly, rethinking faculty development. What are we training to do? We do a lot in teaching and learning. We don't do as much about understanding uh, climate, race, identity, and some of those things are really important. They may not have gotten training on that. So I think we can rethink all of those things. Um, I thought that one of the most successful things that was done was University of Alaska's entire paradigm shift of really thinking cross-disciplinary and also thinking about the communities they serve to develop the One Health initiative. Um, and um, and they had to be very, I would say, reflective about how they operated as a predominantly white institution, research institution with other goals and values that may have been at odds with the communities they actually were serving. That takes a real reflective kind of piece. And from the top to the bottom, including at the system level, they said this is the paradigm shift we want to make. And when they do that, you change the curriculum, you change the research base, you really rethink where those next FTE are going to go, because if you want to further that idea. So I'm not sure, I'm not saying you should adopt that idea, but really think about what kind of a paradigm shift is this really going to be reflective of. It takes good thinking and good people to come together to develop that, but ultimately it then guides curriculum and then guides research, it guides hiring practices.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Hurtado, for your reflective and engaging conversation with us here at The Ohio State University. I also want to thank Provost Bruce McPheron and President Johnson for joining us for this special talk. I found your work, I think I speak for everyone, we found it to be very engaging, and we could probably talk about this for a little longer,
Oh, yes.
given the possibilities. But thank you for the stimulating conversations, engagement, and trying to bring a number of things together as we think about how we might be able to implement some of these things at The Ohio State University. Thank you for your time, and I thank all of the people who have joined us as part of this presentation. And again, good luck with your efforts, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It was a great opportunity. I'm writing about this, so I'm happy to engage. So thank you.